The October morning air carried a sharp bite in Pinewood Ridge, Wyoming, where Robert Hayes sat on his weathered porch, watching his German shepherd Thor pace restlessly around the yard of their small log cabin. At 68, Robert had grown accustomed to quiet mornings like these, where the only sounds were the distant call of mountain birds and the soft padding of Thor's paws on fallen pine needles. The two had been inseparable for the past 5 years, ever since Robert had found the injured puppy abandoned on a hiking trail near his home. What started as a rescue had blossomed into the deepest friendship Robert had known since his military days, when brotherhood meant everything, and loyalty was measured not in words, but in actions. Thor wasn't just a pet. He was Robert's constant companion, his early warning system, and often his only source of conversation in the long, quiet days that stretched between his infrequent trips to town. The dog's intelligent amber eyes seemed to understand every word Robert spoke, every gesture he made, and every emotion that crossed his weathered face. This morning felt different somehow, though Robert couldn't quite put his finger on why. Thor kept looking toward the old pine tree in the backyard, his ears perked forward in that particular way. That meant he'd noticed something important. Robert had learned to trust the dog's instincts completely over the years, knowing that Thor's senses far exceeded his own aging faculties. The massive pine had been a landmark on this property for decades, its thick trunk scarred by lightning strikes and winter storms, but still standing strong against the Wyoming winds. The phone rang at exactly 9:30, cutting through the peaceful morning like a blade. Robert knew who it would be before he even glanced at the caller ID. David Hayes, his only son, calling from his law office in Denver, where he worked as a successful attorney. These calls had become increasingly rare over the past few years, usually brief and businesslike, lacking the warmth that Robert remembered from David's childhood. Robert had been feeling particularly lonely lately, his arthritis acting up and his blood pressure medication making him dizzy, and he'd been hoping that maybe this time the conversation would last more than a few minutes. He answered on the fourth ring, settling into his favorite armchair with Thor immediately taking his position at Robert's feet, as if sensing his master might need extra support. The conversation started normally enough, with David asking about Robert's health in that perfunctory way that suggested he was checking items off a mental list, rather than genuinely caring about the answers. Robert tried to explain that he'd been having some chest pains and wondered if David might visit soon. Maybe bring the grandchildren he rarely got to see. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably, long before David's voice returned, cold and distant. When Robert mentioned feeling scared about living alone and wondered if there might be room for him closer to David's family, his son's response cut deeper than any physical wound Robert had ever received in combat. "We don't care." The 3 words hit Robert like a sledgehammer to the chest, delivered in David's matter-of-fact tone that made them even more devastating. Robert sat in stunned silence, the phone pressed against his ear, wondering if he had misheard or if his son could possibly have meant something else. But David continued without pause, explaining that he and his wife had their own lives to worry about, their own problems to solve, and that Robert needed to stop expecting them to drop everything whenever he felt lonely or scared. The words tumbled out in a rush, as if David had been rehearsing them, talking about how Robert had never really been there for him growing up because of his military service, how he'd chosen duty over family, and how it was too late now to expect his children to fill the emotional void he'd created. Robert tried to interrupt, to explain, to defend the choices he'd made to serve his country and provide for his family. But David wasn't interested in explanations or reconciliation. The conversation ended abruptly when David said he had a meeting to attend, leaving Robert holding a dead phone and feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his entire life. Thor must have sensed his master's distress, because the loyal dog immediately stood up and placed his massive head in Robert's lap, offering the kind of unconditional comfort that only a true friend could provide. Robert buried his face in Thor's thick fur, fighting back tears that came not from physical pain, but from the deeper ache of rejection from the son he had worked so hard to raise and protect. The silence that followed was broken only by Thor's gentle whining, as if the dog understood the magnitude of what had just happened and wanted to offer whatever comfort he could provide. Thor had always been sensitive to Robert's moods, but in the days following that devastating phone call, the dog's behavior became increasingly unusual and focused. Instead of his normal routine of morning walks and afternoon naps in the sun, Thor spent most of his time circling the ancient pine tree in the backyard, whining softly and pawing at the ground near its massive trunk. Robert initially dismissed this behavior as the dog's way of coping with the emotional tension in the house, perhaps chasing after some underground creature or investigating an interesting scent that only his superior nose could detect. But Thor's fixation grew stronger each day, becoming so persistent that Robert found himself watching from the kitchen window as his loyal companion dug small holes around the tree's base, only to fill them in again and start somewhere else. The tree itself was a magnificent specimen, probably planted sometime in the 1920s when the cabin was first built, its thick trunk requiring 3 people to wrap their arms around it completely. Robert's father had mentioned the tree in passing years ago, calling it a landmark that had guided him home from his own adventures in these mountains. But Robert had never paid much attention to such stories. Now, watching Thor's determined behavior, Robert began to wonder if there was something more to the old pine than he had realized. The dog's intelligence had always impressed him, from the way Thor could anticipate his needs to the uncanny ability to sense approaching weather changes hours before they occurred. This felt different, though, more urgent and purposeful than anything Robert had witnessed before. Thor would spend hours at the tree, sometimes barking softly as if trying to communicate something important, his entire body language expressing frustration that his human wasn't understanding what he was trying to show him. On the 4th day of Thor's obsessive behavior around the pine tree, Robert finally decided to investigate what was capturing his companion's attention so completely. The morning was overcast and cool, with the kind of gray sky that promised winter was approaching fast in the Wyoming mountains. Thor immediately ran to the tree when he saw Robert approaching with a small gardening shovel, his tail wagging with excitement and his entire body language expressing satisfaction that his human was finally paying attention to his important discovery. Robert knelt down beside the spots where Thor had been digging most persistently, noting that the ground seemed softer here, as if it had been disturbed sometime in the distant past and never quite settled back to its original density. The soil came away easily under his shovel, much easier than he would have expected for ground that should have been packed solid by decades of weather and root growth. Thor supervised the digging process intently, occasionally barking softly as if offering encouragement or directions, his nose pressed close to the earth as Robert worked deeper. About 18 inches down, the shovel struck something solid that rang with a metallic sound, completely different from the occasional rock that Robert had been expecting to encounter. Thor became even more excited at this sound, dancing around the small hole and looking back and forth between Robert and whatever lay buried beneath them. Robert's heart began to race as he carefully widened the hole, wondering what his father might have buried here all those years ago, and why Thor had been able to sense its presence when Robert had lived in this house for over a decade without having any idea it existed. The metal object turned out to be a rectangular box, roughly the size of a small suitcase, made from what appeared to be military-grade aluminum and sealed with a heavy-duty lock that had somehow survived decades underground without significant corrosion. Robert carefully lifted the box from its earthen hiding place, surprised by its substantial weight, and carried it to his kitchen table where he could examine it properly under good light. Thor followed closely, his excitement palpable as he watched every move Robert made, occasionally whining with anticipation as if he knew this discovery would change everything for both of them. The lock was old but solid, requiring Robert to use a hacksaw from his tool shed to cut through the metal hasp, a process that took nearly an hour and left him sweating from exertion and anticipation. When the lid finally opened with a rusty creak, Robert gasped at what he found inside. Carefully wrapped bundles of documents, old photographs, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps, all preserved in waterproof oilcloth that had kept everything dry and legible despite the years underground. At the very top lay an envelope with his name written in his father's distinctive handwriting. The paper yellowed with age but still intact and readable. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside, immediately recognizing his father William Hayes's careful script from countless letters he had received during his own military service. The letter was dated just 3 months before his father's death, 20 years earlier, and as Robert began to read, he realized that his father had left him a message that would change everything he thought he knew about his family's history and his own future. Thor sat quietly beside the table, as if understanding the magnitude of what they had discovered together. The letter began with his father's characteristic directness, explaining that if Robert was reading these words, it meant Thor or some other guardian had finally led him to the truth that William had kept hidden for decades. William wrote about his younger days, long before Robert was born, when he had worked as a steel worker in the massive industrial complex at Ironworks Valley, about 60 miles northeast of Pinewood Ridge, where he had discovered something that would change the Hayes family's destiny forever. The discovery hadn't been gold or precious stones, but something even more valuable in the modern world. A cache of rare industrial patents, stock certificates, and cash that William's supervisor had been embezzling from the company and hiding in the abandoned sections of the steel plant. When the supervisor died in an industrial accident, William had been the only person who knew about the hidden fortune, and he had quietly retrieved it rather than let it disappear into corporate bureaucracy. The letter explained that William had been careful to keep the discovery secret, knowing that suddenly displaying wealth would bring unwanted attention from both the company and less savory characters who might resort to violence to claim the treasure. He had used only small amounts of the money over the years, investing wisely and ensuring his family lived comfortably without attracting attention to their sudden prosperity. William had planned to pass this information along to Robert when the time was right, but his unexpected heart attack had prevented that conversation from ever taking place. Now, William wrote, the maps and legal documents in the box would guide Robert to the hidden cache in the Ironworks Valley complex, where the majority of the treasure still waited, protected by the abandoned steel plant's natural barriers and careful concealment that had kept it safe for over 4 decades. The total value, William estimated, could easily exceed $2 million in today's currency. Robert read the letter 3 times before its full meaning sank in, each reading revealing new details that painted a picture of his father as a man of incredible foresight and careful planning who had been protecting his family's future through decades of patient secrecy. The maps showed not only the location of the treasure cache within the sprawling Ironworks Valley complex, but also detailed routes through the dangerous industrial terrain, complete with warnings about unstable structures and hazardous materials that would guide someone safely to the hidden wealth. William had even included detailed instructions for accessing the cache, which was sealed behind a massive steel vault door in the plant's underground levels that required specific tools and knowledge to open safely. The legal documents proved the legitimacy of the treasure's ownership, showing that William had properly documented his discovery and maintained legal claim to the assets through a network of lawyers and trust funds that had continued operating even after his death. Robert realized that he was not just the heir to a treasure, but the legal owner of assets worth millions of dollars, all properly documented and waiting for him to claim. The implications were staggering, not just financially, but emotionally. As Robert began to understand that his father had been protecting this secret not out of greed, but out of love, ensuring that future generations of Hayes family members would never face the kind of poverty and desperation that had driven so many working families to ruin. Thor seemed to understand the magnitude of what they had discovered, sitting quietly beside Robert's chair with an almost regal bearing, as if he knew his role in uncovering this family legacy made him part of something much larger than either of them had imagined. The next morning, Robert drove to the Pinewood Ridge Public Library to research his father's claims and verify the information in the documents, bringing along the legal papers but leaving the maps safely hidden at home in case anyone might be watching or listening. The librarian, Emma Rodriguez, had known Robert for years and was intrigued by his sudden interest in local industrial history and property records related to the old Ironworks Valley Steel Complex. Emma was a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair and the kind of encyclopedic knowledge about regional history that came from decades of helping residents research everything from genealogy to property disputes and industrial archaeology. She had always been kind to Robert, often setting aside interesting books about military history or mountain survival that she thought he might enjoy, and their friendship had deepened over the years as they discovered shared interests in local wildlife conservation and historical preservation efforts. Emma's expertise proved invaluable as she helped Robert navigate the complex web of historical industrial records and property transfers that had shaped the development of the Ironworks Valley region throughout the 20th century. Her research confirmed that William Hayes had indeed been employed at the Ironworks Valley steel plant during its most productive years in the 1960s and 1970s, and that he had been regarded as a skilled and trustworthy supervisor with access to sensitive areas of the facility. The property records showed that the steel plant had been officially closed and abandoned in the early 1980s, but that certain sections remained under private ownership through a series of shell companies and legal arrangements that had maintained security and prevented unauthorized access to the site. Emma's investigation also revealed some troubling information about recent activity in the area, including reports of break-ins and suspicious individuals asking questions about the Hayes family's historical connections to the steel plant. Emma's research uncovered newspaper clippings from the 1970s and 1980s mentioning labor disputes and suspicious activities at the Ironworks Valley plant, including several references to a man named Vincent Russo, who had been suspected of intimidating workers and attempting to gain unauthorized access to restricted areas of the facility. Russo had apparently never been convicted of any crimes, but his name appeared repeatedly in connection with industrial theft and property conflicts throughout the region, particularly involving attempts to claim abandoned assets from closed factories and mining operations. More concerning was Emma's discovery that Russo, now in his 70s, was still active in the area and had been asking questions about the Hayes family as recently as 6 months earlier, apparently trying to piece together information about William Hayes's activities at the steel plant. According to security reports that Emma was able to access through her research connections, Russo had been seen near the Ironworks Valley area multiple times in recent months, apparently conducting his own surveys and investigations, despite having no legal right to be on the property. Emma warned Robert that men like Russo rarely gave up on potential treasure, especially when they believed they had invested decades in tracking it down, and that Robert should be extremely careful about how he proceeded with any attempt to recover his father's legacy. Her concern was evident as she helped Robert understand that assets worth $2 million would make the treasure worth killing for, and that Russo's history suggested he wouldn't hesitate to use violence if he thought it would help him claim the Hayes family fortune. Despite these warnings, Robert felt a growing determination to pursue his father's legacy, partly for the financial security it would provide, but mostly to honor the man who had worked so hard to protect his family's future and prove that the Hayes family deserved the respect that David had so cruelly denied. The decision to travel to Ironworks Valley crystallized in Robert's mind over the following days. Despite Emma's warnings and his own recognition of the physical challenges involved in exploring an abandoned industrial complex at his age. At 68, and dealing with arthritis and blood pressure issues, Robert knew he wasn't the ideal candidate for this kind of expedition. But the combination of his father's legacy and his son's rejection had created a powerful motivation that overrode his practical concerns about safety and physical limitations. Thor seemed to sense his master's growing determination and began displaying the kind of alert, focused behavior that Robert remembered from his military days when important missions were being planned, and every detail mattered for success and survival. The dog's intelligence and protective instincts would be invaluable in the dangerous environment of an abandoned steel plant, Robert realized, and he began to see their partnership as the key to successfully recovering the treasure that was rightfully his by inheritance and legal right. Robert spent 3 days gathering supplies and equipment, purchasing modern safety gear to supplement the basic industrial knowledge he had retained from his own working years before military service. He studied topographical maps of the Ironworks Valley region, comparing them with his father's hand-drawn guides and planning a route that would minimize exposure to the most dangerous parts of the complex, while avoiding the main access roads where he might encounter security patrols or unwanted attention from people like Russo. The physical preparation reminded Robert of pre-mission planning from his Army days, and he found himself falling back into old habits of methodical preparation and contingency planning that helped him feel more confident about the challenges ahead. Thor observed these preparations with growing excitement, as if understanding that they were embarking on the most important adventure of their partnership, and his enthusiasm helped bolster Robert's resolve to see this mission through to completion, regardless of the dangers they might face in the abandoned steel plant. The drive to Ironworks Valley took Robert and Thor through some of the most desolate industrial landscape in Wyoming, where the remnants of America's steel empire stood like rusted monuments against the gray October sky. The massive complex loomed larger as they approached, its towering blast furnaces and skeletal framework creating an apocalyptic silhouette that spoke of both industrial might and economic collapse. Robert had chosen to approach from the less monitored eastern entrance, hoping to avoid security cameras and minimize the chances of encountering anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about his purpose at the abandoned facility. The parking area was overgrown with weeds, except for tire tracks that suggested recent visitors, which made Robert slightly uneasy, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Thor immediately began investigating the new environment, his nose working overtime to process the complex mixture of rust, decay, and chemical residue that permeated the air around the steel plant. The dog's behavior was more alert than usual, his ears constantly moving to track sounds that Robert's aging hearing couldn't detect, and his posture suggested he was prepared for potential threats. The sheer scale of the abandoned complex was overwhelming, with buildings stretching for miles in every direction and towering structures that disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. Robert could feel his heart working harder in the thin air and industrial atmosphere, but his determination to honor his father's legacy kept him moving forward despite the intimidating environment that surrounded them. Lisa Chen had been working as a security coordinator for the Ironworks Valley Preservation Project for 3 years, and she immediately noticed the older man and his German shepherd exploring the perimeter of the restricted area. As a former industrial safety inspector, Lisa understood the dangers that abandoned steel plants presented to unauthorized visitors, from unstable structures to hazardous chemical residue that could cause serious health problems. She approached Robert with professional concern rather than hostility, genuinely worried about his safety in an environment that had already claimed several lives from urban explorers and scrap metal thieves who underestimated the facility's dangers. Lisa was a compact woman in her 40s, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of dealing with industrial hazards, and her questions about Robert's destination and experience level were clearly motivated by genuine concern for his welfare. Robert provided vague answers about researching family history connected to the steel plant, but Lisa's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation, especially given his age and the obvious risks involved. The coordinator's concern deepened when she learned that Robert was planning to explore the more dangerous sections of the complex without proper safety equipment or communication devices that could summon help if something went wrong. Lisa warned about the unpredictable structural integrity of buildings that had been abandoned for decades, mentioning recent incidents where floors had collapsed and visitors had been injured by falling debris. More troubling from Robert's perspective was Lisa's casual mention of increased suspicious activity in the area, including reports of unauthorized excavation work and aggressive individuals who had been harassing other visitors, suggesting that someone was conducting illegal treasure hunting operations within the complex. Following his father's map through the labyrinthine Ironworks Valley complex proved more challenging than Robert had anticipated, as decades of decay and vandalism had altered many of the landmarks that William Hayes had noted in his careful directions. The massive steel structures created a maze of corridors and passages where every rusted beam and collapsed walkway looked remarkably similar, making navigation extremely difficult even with detailed instructions. Thor proved invaluable during this phase of their exploration, his superior senses helping to identify the subtle differences between buildings and his instinctive understanding of safe versus dangerous paths, keeping them away from unstable structures that could collapse without warning. The dog seemed to understand that they were following a specific route rather than randomly exploring, staying close to Robert while ranging ahead, just far enough to scout for obstacles or hazards that might impede their progress toward their destination. Robert found himself relying more heavily on Thor's judgment as the industrial terrain became more treacherous, trusting the dog's instincts about which walkways looked safe and which areas should be avoided entirely due to structural damage or chemical contamination. The afternoon sun cast eerie shadows through the skeletal framework of the steel plant, creating a constantly changing pattern of light and darkness that made navigation even more disorienting and dangerous. However, by late afternoon, both Robert and Thor began sensing that they were not alone in the vast complex, with Thor frequently stopping to look back along their route and exhibiting the kind of alert behavior that suggested someone or something was following them through the maze of abandoned buildings. Robert initially attributed this to normal wildlife activity or echoes from their own movement, but Thor's continued concern began to make him genuinely nervous about who else might be interested in their destination within the steel plant. The confrontation Robert had been dreading occurred just as the sun was beginning to set behind the western smokestacks, casting the industrial complex into the deep shadows that would soon become complete darkness, punctuated only by the occasional streetlight that still functioned after decades of abandonment. Thor had been growing increasingly agitated for the past hour, occasionally growling softly at sounds that Robert couldn't hear, when three men stepped out from behind a cluster of rusted machinery directly ahead of them on the pathway between buildings. The leader was clearly Vincent Russo, matching Emma's description right down to the cold, calculating eyes that suggested a man accustomed to taking what he wanted, regardless of who got hurt in the process. And his appearance confirmed Robert's worst fears about being tracked to this location. Russo appeared to be in his early 70s, but moved with the confidence of someone who remained physically dangerous despite his age. And his two companions looked like the kind of men who were comfortable with violence as a primary means of solving problems and eliminating obstacles. Robert immediately understood that this encounter was not a coincidence, and that Russo had been tracking him since he arrived at Ironworks Valley, probably hoping that Robert would lead him directly to the treasure that had eluded him for decades of searching. Russo's opening words confirmed Robert's worst fears, as the older man smiled coldly and demanded that Robert hand over the maps and any other information he had about William Hayes's activities at the steel plant during his employment there. When Robert pretended not to understand what Russo was talking about, the man's expression hardened, and he explained with disturbing casualness that he had been watching the Hayes family for years, waiting for someone to make a move toward the treasure he believed rightfully belonged to him through some twisted logic of industrial entitlement. Thor sensed the danger in the situation before Robert fully understood how serious their predicament had become. Positioning himself between his master and the three men while exhibiting the kind of controlled aggression that made it clear he was prepared to fight, if necessary, to protect Robert from harm. Russo seemed amused by the dog's protective stance, commenting that Thor was a fine animal who deserved a better master than someone stupid enough to walk into an abandoned steel plant with valuable information and no protection besides a pet dog. The insult triggered something in Robert that he hadn't felt since his military days, a cold anger that helped him think more clearly despite the immediate physical danger he and Thor were facing from men who obviously had no compunction about using violence. Robert realized that Russo's plan was probably to force him to guide them to the treasure cache and then eliminate both him and Thor as witnesses, which meant that cooperation would ultimately be just as dangerous as resistance in this situation. When Russo stepped closer and reached toward Robert's backpack, where he suspected the maps were hidden, Thor erupted into action with a speed and ferocity that caught all three men completely off guard, despite their experience with intimidation and violence. The German Shepherd launched himself at Russo's nearest companion, a thin man who had been trying to circle around behind Robert, knocking him backward into a piece of heavy machinery with enough force to leave him dazed and temporarily out of the fight. Robert used the distraction to grab his walking stick and swing it at Russo himself, catching the older man across the shoulder and causing him to stumble backward while cursing loudly and reaching for something in his jacket that Robert suspected might be a weapon. The element of surprise gave Robert and Thor a crucial advantage, but Robert knew they had to escape quickly before Russo and his men could regroup and bring their superior numbers and ruthlessness to bear against them. The escape through the darkening steel complex became a nightmare of stumbling over unseen obstacles and navigating around dangerous structural hazards while trying to maintain enough speed to stay ahead of their pursuers, who Robert could hear crashing through the industrial debris behind them with determination born of greed and years of obsessive planning. Thor proved invaluable during this desperate flight, using his superior night vision and instinctive understanding of the complex's layout to guide Robert away from dead ends and structural hazards that could have ended their escape attempt in disaster or serious injury. Robert's military training helped him maintain some sense of direction, despite the panic and adrenaline coursing through his system. But he knew they couldn't maintain this pace indefinitely, given his age and the physical demands of navigating through an obstacle course of industrial wreckage in near darkness. The sound of pursuit seemed to be getting closer, and Robert realized they needed to find some kind of defensive position where they could make a stand or hide until their enemies gave up the search, though he suspected that men like Russo wouldn't give up easily when millions of dollars were at stake. Thor seemed to understand the urgency of their situation, leading Robert toward what appeared to be one of the larger industrial buildings that might provide cover or multiple escape routes, when Robert suddenly felt his foot catch on a piece of twisted metal and found himself tumbling forward into what turned out to be a maintenance pit he hadn't seen in the darkness. The fall knocked the wind out of him and sent sharp pains through his left shoulder and ribs, but Thor was immediately beside him, helping him to his feet, while keeping watch for signs of their pursuers approaching their location. Robert realized they had inadvertently found a good hiding place in the pit, which was deep enough to conceal them if they remained quiet and still, and he made the decision to stay put until morning, rather than risk further movement through the dangerous terrain during complete darkness when even Thor's superior senses might not be enough to keep them safe. The night in the maintenance pit tested both Robert's endurance and his partnership with Thor, as they huddled together for warmth while listening for any sounds that might indicate their enemies were still searching the industrial complex for them. Robert's shoulder and ribs throbbed with pain that suggested he might have suffered more than just bruises in his fall, but he forced himself to ignore the discomfort while focusing on more immediate concerns, like staying warm and planning their approach to the treasure cache once daylight returned. Thor seemed to understand the need for absolute silence, remaining alert and watchful while providing his body heat to help keep Robert from developing hypothermia in the cold Wyoming night that settled over the abandoned steel plant. The dog's thick coat was designed for exactly these conditions, but Robert's industrial work clothes offered limited protection against the metal surfaces that conducted heat away from his body with relentless efficiency. As dawn began to break over the eastern towers of the complex, Robert felt a renewed sense of determination and purpose, knowing that today would determine whether his father's legacy would fall into the hands of thieves or be recovered by the rightful heir. The early morning light revealed that they had spent the night less than half a mile from the central blast furnace area where his father had hidden the main treasure cache, according to the landmarks visible from their position in the maintenance pit. Robert and Thor approached the massive blast furnace that dominated the center of the Ironworks Valley complex, its towering structure rising nearly 200 feet into the gray morning sky like a monument to America's industrial past. According to his father's detailed instructions, the entrance to the treasure cache was located through an old freight elevator system that had once transported materials between the furnace levels, and which should still be operational despite decades of abandonment, thanks to the robust engineering of the original construction. Thor seemed to sense the importance of their destination, moving with increased alertness as they navigated through the maze of pipes, conveyor systems, and control rooms that surrounded the central furnace structure. Robert found the elevator access panel exactly where his father's map indicated, hidden behind a section of removable steel plating that required specific knowledge to locate and open safely. The elevator itself was a massive industrial platform designed to carry tons of steel and equipment, and to Robert's amazement, the basic mechanical systems still functioned when he activated the manual controls using techniques his father had described in the instructions. The descent into the lower levels of the blast furnace was both thrilling and terrifying, as Robert realized he was following in his father's footsteps toward a secret that had been protected for over 4 decades. Thor remained calm during the elevator ride, though his ears were constantly moving as he monitored the sounds of the mechanical systems and watched for any signs of danger in the industrial environment that surrounded them. The elevator came to rest at a sub-basement level that Robert hadn't even known existed, revealing a network of maintenance tunnels and storage areas that had been designed to support the massive furnace operations above them. The treasure cache that William Hayes had created in the depths of the blast furnace exceeded every expectation that Robert had formed during his research and preparation for this expedition. The underground chamber contained not just cash and stock certificates, but an entire archive of industrial secrets, patent documents, and financial instruments that represented decades of careful accumulation and strategic planning by his father. Massive steel safes lined the walls, each one containing different categories of valuable materials that William had organized with military precision and attention to detail. Gold bars were stacked in one section, bearer bonds in another, and rare coins and collectibles in specially designed cases that had protected them from moisture and decay. Robert estimated that the total value of the cache could easily exceed $2 million. But more importantly, he understood that his father had created something far more valuable than money, a legacy of intelligence, planning, and dedication to family that represented the best qualities of the Hayes family name. Thor explored the chamber with obvious fascination, his tail wagging as he seemed to understand that they had achieved something truly remarkable by finding this hidden fortune that had been waiting for them to claim it. The chamber also contained detailed records of William's years at the steel plant, including documentation of the supervisor's embezzlement scheme that had originally led to the discovery of the hidden assets. Robert found himself overcome with emotion as he realized the magnitude of what his father had accomplished, not just in accumulating this wealth, but in creating a system that would preserve it for future generations while keeping it secret from those who would have stolen it through violence or legal manipulation. The moment of triumph was shattered when Vincent Russo and his two companions appeared at the chamber entrance, having apparently tracked Robert and Thor through the morning light, despite their careful attempts at concealment during the night and their cautious approach to the blast furnace. Russo's expression showed a mixture of triumph and greed as he surveyed the treasure that had been the object of his obsession for so many years, and his words made it clear that he intended to claim everything regardless of Robert's legal rights or his father's legitimate ownership of the cache through decades of careful accumulation. Robert realized that Russo must have been following the Hayes family's activities for much longer than anyone had suspected, waiting for exactly this moment when someone would lead him to the treasure he believed he deserved through some twisted sense of entitlement. The older man's companions spread out to block any possibility of escape, while Russo himself approached the treasure with the kind of reverence that suggested he had dreamed about this moment for most of his adult life and had been willing to commit any crime necessary to achieve it. Marcus tried to reason with Russo, explaining that the legal documents in the chamber proved the Hayes family's ownership and that taking the treasure would constitute theft of clearly established private property. But Russo laughed at these arguments and made it clear that he had no intention of allowing Robert to leave the chamber alive to report the theft to authorities. Thor positioned himself protectively in front of Robert, but the confined space of the underground chamber limited his ability to maneuver effectively, and Robert realized they were in an extremely dangerous situation with limited options for defense or escape. Russo's confidence grew as he began examining the treasure more closely, commenting that William Hayes had done all the hard work of accumulation and preservation, making it easy for Russo to simply take over the operation and claim credit for the discovery. The weather outside the blast furnace had been deteriorating throughout the morning, and by the time Russo began making specific threats about eliminating Robert and Thor as obstacles to his theft, a severe thunderstorm was developing that would soon create dangerous conditions throughout the steel complex, with its combination of lightning, flooding, and high winds. Robert realized that the storm might actually work in their favor if they could find a way to use it as cover for an escape attempt. But Russo seemed unconcerned about the weather and more focused on the immediate problem of securing the treasure and dealing with witnesses who could identify him. The temperature in the underground chamber was dropping rapidly as the storm systems moved overhead, and Robert could see that Thor was beginning to sense the atmospheric changes that preceded severe weather events, making the dog increasingly restless and alert. Russo ordered his men to begin moving the most valuable items from the chamber, while he kept Robert and Thor under guard, making it clear that he planned to transport the treasure in multiple trips, rather than risk losing everything to a single accident or discovery by security personnel. Robert watched helplessly as decades of his father's careful work were being systematically stolen by men who had no legal or moral right to any of it. But he also began to notice that Russo's companions were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the sounds of the approaching storm and the implications of what they were being asked to do. The thunder outside was becoming severe enough that even experienced industrial workers would have difficulty maintaining focus on their tasks, and Robert began to hope that the weather might force Russo to make mistakes that could be exploited by someone with Thor's protective instincts and his own military training in crisis situations. Russo's impatience with the slow progress of moving treasure in deteriorating weather conditions led him to make the critical error that Robert had been hoping for, deciding to force Robert to help carry the heavy safes and cash bundles through the industrial complex to a vehicle that Russo claimed was hidden in a secure location. Robert pretended to cooperate while actually looking for opportunities to escape or turn the tables on his captors, and Thor seemed to understand that they were waiting for the right moment to make their move against men who had underestimated both their determination and their capabilities. The thunderstorm had intensified to the point where lightning strikes were creating power fluctuations throughout the complex, and the sound of thunder made communication difficult even at close range, creating conditions that favored someone with Thor's superior senses over humans who were dependent on sight and hearing for coordination. When Russo ordered Robert to carry a heavy case of bearer bonds toward the chamber entrance, Robert deliberately stumbled on the uneven floor, spilling the contents and creating enough confusion for Thor to launch a surprise attack on the nearest of Russo's companions. The German Shepherd's assault was perfectly timed and devastatingly effective, knocking the man down and sending his weapon sliding across the chamber floor, beyond anyone's immediate reach. Robert used the distraction to grab a heavy gold bar and swing it at Russo himself, catching the older man across the side of the head with enough force to stagger him and cause him to drop his own weapon while cursing loudly and clutching his injured skull. The sudden reversal of fortune gave Robert and Thor a crucial advantage, but Robert knew they had to press their attack quickly before Russo's remaining companion could recover from his shock and join the fight with potentially deadly consequences. The battle inside the underground chamber was brief but vicious, with Thor demonstrating the kind of controlled ferocity that made German Shepherds such effective military and police dogs, while Robert relied on his combat training to stay ahead of opponents who were younger and potentially stronger, but less experienced in actual fighting. Russo recovered from the initial blow more quickly than Robert had hoped, lunging toward his dropped weapon while his uninjured companion tried to grab Thor and eliminate the dog as a threat to their operation. Robert realized that their only chance was to get outside where the storm conditions might give them an advantage over their enemies, and he began moving toward the chamber entrance, while calling for Thor to follow him toward the elevator that would take them back to the surface levels. However, Russo had anticipated this move and positioned himself between Robert and the elevator controls, forcing Robert to find an alternative escape route through the maze of maintenance tunnels that connected the underground levels of the blast furnace. The transition from the relatively sheltered chamber to the industrial tunnels filled with the sounds of the storm above was disorienting. But Robert's military experience helped him navigate through the darkness, while Thor provided guidance based on his superior senses and protective instincts. Behind them, Robert could hear Russo and his men shouting to each other as they gave chase through the tunnel system. But the storm noise and industrial echoes were making it difficult for them to coordinate their pursuit effectively, giving Robert and Thor a temporary advantage that they needed to exploit quickly before their enemies could reorganize and cut off their escape routes. The chase through the blast furnace's tunnel system became a test of endurance and industrial knowledge that pushed both Robert and Thor to their physical limits, while demonstrating the superior teamwork they had developed through years of partnership and mutual trust in dangerous situations. Thor's ability to navigate by scent and instinct proved invaluable in conditions where human senses were almost useless, and Robert found himself relying completely on the dog's guidance while trying to maintain enough awareness of their surroundings to avoid industrial hazards like exposed electrical systems and chemical residue. The tunnels were filled with the sounds of the storm above, creating an acoustic maze where every thunder crash and lightning strike seemed to come from a different direction, making it impossible for anyone to track movement by sound alone. Robert could occasionally hear shouts behind them that suggested Russo and his men were still following, but the sounds seemed to be getting more distant and less coordinated, indicating that the criminals were having even more difficulty with the conditions than Robert and Thor were experiencing. However, the physical demands of navigating through the tunnel system were taking their toll on Robert, whose age and recent injuries were sapping his strength more rapidly than he had anticipated, while Thor seemed to understand his master's limitations and adjusted his pace accordingly without compromising their lead over their pursuers. The storm above was so severe that Robert began to worry about the structural integrity of the aging tunnel system, realizing that lightning strikes or flooding could create additional hazards that would trap them underground with no way to escape or summon help from the surface. The tunnel system eventually led Robert and Thor to an emergency exit that brought them back to the surface level of the blast furnace. But their relief at escaping the underground maze was immediately replaced by new dangers as the thunderstorm raged around the industrial complex with unprecedented fury. Lightning strikes were hitting the tall structures throughout Ironworks Valley, creating spectacular but terrifying displays of electrical energy that illuminated the abandoned steel plant like some apocalyptic landscape from a nightmare. Robert realized that the metal structures around them made the entire area extremely dangerous during an electrical storm, but they had no choice but to keep moving, to stay ahead of Russo and his men, who would certainly resume their pursuit once they found the emergency exit. Thor seemed to understand the danger posed by the lightning, leading Robert away from the tallest structures and toward areas where they might find better shelter from both the electrical activity and their human enemies. The wind and rain made visibility extremely poor, which provided concealment, but also made navigation treacherous as they moved through an industrial obstacle course of abandoned equipment and structural debris. Robert's military training helped him recognize that the storm conditions were actually providing them with tactical advantages, as the noise and confusion would make it difficult for Russo to coordinate an effective search, while the electrical activity would force everyone to seek shelter periodically. However, Robert also knew that they couldn't survive indefinitely in these conditions without proper shelter, and he began looking for a building or structure that could protect them from the elements while they planned their next move. The search for shelter led Robert and Thor to one of the complex's main control buildings, which had been constructed to withstand industrial accidents and severe weather, making it an ideal refuge from the storm that continued to rage around them. The building's emergency systems were still partially functional, providing basic lighting and communication capabilities that had been maintained for safety reasons even after the plant's closure. Robert was able to use the emergency communication system to contact Lisa Chen, who immediately mobilized a security and rescue team despite the dangerous weather conditions that made travel extremely hazardous. Thor remained alert throughout their time in the control building, occasionally moving to windows to watch for signs of Russo and his men, but the storm seemed to have forced everyone to seek shelter rather than continue their dangerous game of pursuit through the electrified industrial landscape. Lisa and her team arrived at first light, bringing medical assistance for Robert's injuries and proper security to ensure that Russo could be apprehended when he eventually emerged from whatever shelter he had found during the night. The rescue operation was complicated by the storm damage throughout the complex, but Lisa's experience with industrial emergencies helped her coordinate an effective response that prioritized getting Robert and Thor to safety while securing the evidence of Russo's attempted robbery. When Russo and his companions were finally located and arrested, they were found trying to salvage some of the treasure that had been scattered during the fight, providing clear evidence of their criminal intent and ensuring that they would face serious charges for their actions. Robert felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for his own rescue, but for the fact that Thor had remained loyal and protective throughout the ordeal, demonstrating the kind of partnership that transcended the normal relationship between human and animal. The aftermath of the rescue operation brought both medical attention for Robert's injuries and legal resolution for the treasure dispute that had nearly cost both him and Thor their lives in the underground chamber and tunnel system of the blast furnace. Robert was treated for bruised ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and exhaustion, while Thor received veterinary care for minor cuts and scratches he had sustained during the fight with Russo's men. Both recovered quickly, thanks to the excellent medical care they received, and the relief of knowing that the treasure was finally secure and legally protected from future theft attempts. Lisa Chen helped coordinate the legal documentation that would be necessary to establish Robert's clear ownership of the treasure, working with attorneys and government officials to ensure that all procedures were followed correctly. Emma Rodriguez joined them at the hospital, bringing additional historical documentation that supported Robert's claim and expressing her relief that the research she had conducted had helped lead to a successful resolution rather than tragedy. The local authorities were impressed by the sophisticated nature of William Hayes's treasure cache and the meticulous documentation he had maintained to ensure its legal status, recognizing that this was a legitimate inheritance rather than some kind of criminal enterprise. Robert found himself emotionally overwhelmed by the support he received from people like Lisa and Emma, who had helped him navigate the dangerous situation and ensure that his father's legacy would be properly honored, rather than stolen by men like Russo, who had no respect for law or family bonds. The legal process of establishing Robert's ownership of the treasure proceeded smoothly, thanks to the meticulous documentation that William Hayes had maintained throughout his decades of careful planning and asset accumulation. The attorneys who reviewed the case were impressed by the thoroughness of William's record-keeping, which included not only proof of the original discovery, but also detailed chains of ownership, tax documentation, and legal structures that had protected the assets from corporate claims or government seizure. Robert found himself working with financial advisors and estate planning specialists, who helped him understand the full scope of his inheritance, which included not just the physical treasure, but also investment accounts and real estate holdings that William had quietly accumulated over the years. The total value of the Hayes family legacy exceeded $3 million when all assets were properly evaluated, making Robert one of the wealthiest residents of Wyoming almost overnight. However, the most valuable aspect of the inheritance wasn't financial, but emotional, as Robert finally understood the depth of his father's love and the sacrifices William had made to ensure his family's future security. Thor seemed to understand that their lives had changed dramatically, displaying a kind of dignified satisfaction as he observed the lawyers and financial experts who came to visit their temporary hotel suite while the legal proceedings were completed. The dog's role in discovering the treasure was widely recognized, with several news outlets requesting interviews about the remarkable German shepherd who had literally sniffed out a multi-million-dollar fortune. Robert insisted that Thor be properly credited as a hero, not just for finding the treasure, but for protecting Robert throughout the dangerous confrontation with Russo and his criminal associates. The transformation from struggling veteran to millionaire happened so quickly that Robert sometimes felt overwhelmed by the changes, but Thor's constant presence provided stability and continuity that helped him adapt to their new circumstances. The phone call from David came 3 weeks after the treasure story appeared in national news outlets, transforming the son who had coldly dismissed his father's needs into someone desperate to rebuild their relationship. David's voice carried a mixture of shame and calculation as he apologized for his earlier harsh words, claiming that work stress and family pressures had caused him to react inappropriately to Robert's requests for support and connection. Robert listened quietly as David explained that he had always loved his father and had never meant to hurt him, though the timing of this emotional revelation so soon after the treasure discovery made its sincerity questionable. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Robert's life, as he struggled to balance his desire for family reconciliation with his recognition that David's sudden change of heart was clearly motivated by financial considerations rather than genuine remorse. Robert found himself thinking about Thor's unwavering loyalty throughout their adventures, contrasting the dog's selfless devotion with his son's conditional love that seemed to depend on Robert's financial status. When David suggested that they should put the past behind them and focus on building a relationship for the grandchildren's sake, Robert felt a clarity that had been missing from his life since that devastating phone call months earlier. He explained to David that reconciliation was possible, but only if David could accept Thor as a full member of the Hayes family. Recognizing the dog's heroic role in recovering the family legacy and his irreplaceable importance in Robert's life, David's hesitation before agreeing to this condition revealed everything Robert needed to know about his son's priorities. But Robert chose to interpret the eventual agreement as a genuine step toward healing their damaged relationship. The conversation ended with plans for David's family to visit Wyoming, where they would meet Thor properly and begin the slow process of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by years of neglect and indifference. The Hayes Foundation for Veteran Support became Robert's primary focus as he sought meaningful ways to use his newfound wealth for purposes that would honor both his father's memory and his own military service. Working with experienced nonprofit administrators, Robert created a comprehensive program that provided financial assistance, counseling services, and companion animal placement for veterans struggling with isolation, PTSD, and economic hardship. The foundation's centerpiece was the Thor Training Center, a state-of-the-art facility where rescue dogs were trained specifically to work with veterans who needed loyal companions to help them navigate the challenges of civilian life. Robert insisted that Thor serve as the program's ambassadorial dog, demonstrating the remarkable bond that could develop between veterans and properly trained German shepherds who understood the unique needs of former military personnel. The training center attracted national attention from both military and civilian organizations, with Thor becoming something of a celebrity as his story inspired others to consider the healing power of human-animal partnerships. Robert found deep satisfaction in watching Thor work with other veterans, seeing how the dog's calm intelligence and protective instincts could help damaged people rebuild their confidence and reconnect with civilian society. The foundation also provided direct financial assistance to veterans facing eviction, medical crises, or other emergencies that threatened their basic security, with Robert personally reviewing each case to ensure that help reached those who needed it most. Local news outlets regularly featured stories about the foundation's work, with Thor often appearing in photographs alongside the veterans he had helped, creating a positive cycle of publicity that attracted additional donations and volunteer support. Robert realized that his father's legacy had become something far greater than a simple inheritance, evolving into a force for healing and community support that would continue long after Robert himself was gone. The Christmas gathering at Robert's new ranch house represented a milestone in the Hayes family's journey toward reconciliation, with David's family finally meeting Thor as a respected member of the household, rather than simply a pet to be tolerated. Robert watched with quiet satisfaction as his grandchildren, initially nervous around the large German shepherd, gradually warmed to Thor's gentle nature and obvious intelligence, laughing with delight as the hero dog demonstrated some of the search and rescue techniques he had learned during his training center work. David himself seemed genuinely impressed by Thor's remarkable abilities and his obvious devotion to Robert, admitting that he had never understood the depth of the bond between his father and the dog until he witnessed it firsthand. The conversation around the dinner table included stories about the treasure discovery and the dangerous confrontation with Russo, with Thor lying contentedly beside Robert's chair, as if understanding that he was being honored for his heroic actions. David's wife and children peppered Robert with questions about his military service and his father's remarkable foresight in creating the hidden legacy, showing a level of interest in family history that had been absent for years. Robert found himself sharing memories and stories that he hadn't talked about in decades, feeling a renewed connection to his own past and a growing hope for the future of his family relationships. The evening concluded with Robert officially establishing trust funds for his grandchildren's education, ensuring that William Hayes's legacy would continue to benefit future generations, while teaching them the values of service, loyalty, and family responsibility that had made the treasure possible in the first place. As the family prepared to leave, Robert noticed David quietly thanking Thor for taking care of his father, a moment of genuine emotion that suggested their reconciliation might indeed be based on more than financial considerations. The snow falling outside the ranch house windows created a peaceful backdrop for what Robert hoped would be the first of many family gatherings, with Thor's presence serving as a reminder that loyalty and love could overcome even the deepest wounds when given the chance to heal. Tell your friends about the incredible bond between veterans and their canine companions, and remember to support the organizations that help our heroes find the loyal friendship they deserve. The greatest treasures in life aren't always measured in dollars, but in the unwavering devotion of those who stand by us through every challenge and triumph.